I remember the exact moment the question first appeared. Not because anything dramatic happened. No lightning, no revelation, no life-changing conversation. Just a small coincidence that should have been easy to forget. The kind of thing most people dismiss before the day is over. Yet for some reason, I never did. I was sitting alone by a window late one evening, watching rain move across the glass. The room was quiet except for the distant sound of traffic and the occasional vibration of my phone. I had spent most of that year feeling as though I was walking through a hallway filled with closed doors. Plans failed. Opportunities disappeared. People left. Nothing catastrophic. Just enough disappointment to make me wonder whether I had somehow fallen out of sync with my own life. That night, I opened an old notebook I had not touched in years. I was not searching for anything specific, at least that is what I believed. As I turned the pages, I found a list I had written long ago. Ideas, goals, places I wanted to go, people I hoped to meet, dreams that felt important at the time. Some had happened, most had not. But one sentence stopped me. I stared at it longer than I should have, because it described something I had completely forgotten writing. Something that years later had happened almost exactly as I described it. Not perfectly, not literally, but close enough to leave me uncomfortable, close enough to make me ask a question. How? At the time, I ignored it. I told myself memory plays tricks. People remember the hits and forget the misses. There was probably a reasonable explanation. And maybe there was. But the pattern returned. A few weeks later, I found myself driving down an empty road just after sunset. You know those moments when the world feels strangely paused? No messages, no calls, no noise, just your thoughts keeping you company. I began thinking about a decision I had made years earlier. One of those decisions that seemed insignificant when it happened. A road not taken, a conversation avoided, a message never sent. I remember wondering how different my life might have been if I had acted differently. Then my phone lit up. The message came from someone connected to that exact period of my life. Someone I had not heard from in years. The timing was strange, not impossible. Just strange, and that is where the question began. Because once could be coincidence, twice could still be coincidence. But what do you call it when similar moments keep appearing throughout an entire life? I started paying attention, not obsessively, not looking for signs behind every shadow, just observing, collecting evidence. Like someone standing over a puzzle without realizing he has been holding pieces of it for years. The more I looked, the more I noticed certain themes repeating. Closed doors that later protected me. Missed opportunities that eventually led somewhere better. People who entered my life at exactly the wrong time. Or so I thought. Years later, I would realize those encounters taught me lessons I desperately needed. Lessons I could not have learned any other way. Looking back, the timing feels impossible to ignore. Have you ever experienced that? A moment that seemed meaningless when it happened, but became significant years later. A delay that frustrated you at the time, but later made perfect sense. I think many people have. Most simply never stop long enough to examine it. Life moves too quickly. There is always another responsibility, another distraction, another reason to avoid difficult questions. But eventually I reached a point where I could not dismiss them anymore. The evidence kept accumulating. like letters arriving from a sender I could not identify. Some came through unexpected encounters, others through dreams that lingered long after morning arrived. A few came disguised as disappointments. Those were the hardest to understand, especially because loneliness has a way of distorting perspective. When enough things fail, you begin assuming future things will fail too. When enough people leave, you start expecting everyone to leave. When enough doors close, eventually you stop knocking. I know that feeling better than I wish I did. There were years when I sat in quiet cafes watching strangers come and go, wondering why certain chapters of my life seemed permanently unfinished. Years when airport departures felt symbolic. Years when I carried hopes that never found a destination. Years when I convinced myself that perhaps there was no larger pattern at all. Only randomness, only chance, only disconnected events pretending to be meaningful because the human mind hates unanswered questions. That explanation satisfied me for a while. Then something happened that complicated everything. I began noticing repetition. Not exact repetition, something subtler. The same lessons arriving through different people. The same challenges appearing in different forms. The same emotional crossroads waiting for me under different circumstances. It happened once, then twice, then again. Different faces, different places, same lesson. I still cannot fully explain it. And maybe explanation is not the right goal. Maybe understanding begins with observation. Look closely at your own life for a moment. Think about the roads that ended unexpectedly, the opportunities that disappeared, the people you almost met, the conversations that nearly happened, the timing that never seemed to make sense. What if some of those events belong to the same story? What if coincidence is simply a pattern we do not understand yet? I am not trying to prove destiny. I am trying to understand the evidence. And somewhere along the way, another possibility entered my investigation. A possibility I resisted more than any other. What if all those delays, detours, unanswered questions, and perfectly imperfect moments were not leading to an event? What if they were leading to a person? I did not know who. I still do not. But for the first time, I stopped assuming every closed door meant rejection. Some began to look like redirection. And that observation changed the way I viewed everything that came before. Because the more pieces I uncovered, the less random the puzzle appeared. And somehow, for reasons I still cannot explain, that realization eventually led me to wonder about you. The strange thing about patterns is that they rarely announce themselves. They do not arrive carrying answers. They arrive carrying questions. And for a long time, I mistook them for bad luck. When I look back now, I can see entire seasons of my life defined by almosts, almost getting the opportunity, almost reaching the destination, almost becoming the person I thought I was supposed to be. Everything seemed to stop one step before completion. At first, I blamed circumstances. Then I blamed people. Eventually, I blamed myself. That seemed easier. At least self-blame creates the illusion of control. But none of those explanations survived very long. Because every time I thought I had identified the cause, the pattern returned in a different form. Different situation. Same feeling. Different road. Same lesson. And that was when I started keeping mental notes. Not because I believed in destiny. Not because I believed every event carried hidden meaning. I simply wanted to understand why certain experiences seemed determined to repeat themselves. One memory stands out more than the others. I was staying in a hotel room in a city where I knew almost no one. The curtains were slightly open. The lights from distant buildings stretched across the room. I remember sitting on the edge of the bed staring at the reflection in the window. Not because anything terrible had happened. Actually, things were going reasonably well. That was what made the feeling so confusing. Externally, life appeared stable. Internally, something felt unfinished, like a sentence missing its final words, like a puzzle with one piece absent. I could not identify what was missing, only that it was. And then something occurred to me. The feeling was familiar. Not familiar from days earlier, familiar from years earlier. I had felt it before, in another city, under entirely different circumstances, around completely different people. Yet somehow the emotional signature was identical. That realization stayed with me, because situations can change, locations can change, people can change. So why do certain feelings return as if they have memorized the route back to us? At the time, I ignored it, but the pattern returned. Months later, I was cleaning out old boxes. Most of it was ordinary. Receipts, photographs, notes I had forgotten existed. Then I found a letter. One I had written but never sent. You may know the kind. The words we write when honesty feels safer on paper than in conversation. I read it slowly, and halfway through I stopped. Not because the letter was emotional, because it contained concerns that still existed years later. Different details, same fears, different names, same questions. That unsettled me. How many lessons had I been repeating without realizing it? How many detours had I mistaken for new roads when they were actually old roads wearing different clothes? And that is where the investigation deepened. I stopped focusing only on events. I began studying repetition itself, the recurring disappointments, the recurring hopes, the recurring mistakes, the recurring opportunities. Especially the opportunities. Because some opportunities seemed to vanish, no matter how hard I pursued them. Others arrived unexpectedly, without effort. Looking back, the timing feels impossible to ignore. There were moments I desperately wanted something, worked for it, planned for it, prayed for it, only to watch it disappear. At the time, those losses felt unfair. I spent years carrying questions I could not answer. Why close that door? Why remove that possibility? Why allow the dream if it was never meant to happen? I suspect you may have asked similar questions. Maybe not the same ones, but questions born from the same place. Questions that arrive after disappointment. Questions that sit beside us in waiting rooms. Questions that stare back from late-night windows. Questions that refuse to leave. What happened next made me reconsider everything. One by one, some of those closed doors began revealing what stood behind them. Not immediately. Years later. That was the surprising part. Time changed the evidence. Situations I once considered failures slowly transformed into protection. People I once wished had stayed would later prove they were never meant to remain. Paths I fought to enter would eventually lead somewhere I was grateful to avoid. I still cannot fully explain it, but the pattern became harder to dismiss. The more distance I gained from certain events, the more intentional their timing appeared. Not perfect, not painless, but purposeful. There was another detail I noticed too. Certain numbers seemed to appear repeatedly during important moments, not in dramatic ways, just enough to catch my attention, enough to make me pause, enough to make me wonder whether my mind was creating connections that did not exist. I remain skeptical about those things. Maybe there is a simple explanation. Maybe there always is. Yet I cannot deny how often those small repetitions arrive during crossroads in my life, like markers on a trail, not telling me where to go, only reminding me to pay attention. Stay with me for a moment, because this is where the pieces start connecting. The more I studied the major events, the less important they became. The real mystery was not what happened. The mystery was what kept repeating. The same lesson about patience, the same lesson about trust, the same lesson about timing. Again and again, different forms, same message. And eventually a new question emerged. What if life repeats lessons until we finally understand them? What if certain people appear more than once, not literally, but symbolically? What if familiar feelings are not accidents? What if they are invitations? Invitations to notice something we missed before. Invitations to grow. Invitations to prepare. Because the truth is, many of the most important moments in my life looked completely ordinary when they happened. Only years later did they reveal their significance. And that realization has become one of the strongest pieces of evidence in this investigation. The ordinary moments, the overlooked conversations, the missed calls, the unexpected delays, the roads that seemed empty at the time. I have begun to suspect some of them were never random, and if that suspicion is true, then another possibility becomes difficult to ignore. Maybe the answers I have been searching for were never hidden in the dramatic moments. Maybe they were hidden in the repetitions. And if that is true, then somewhere ahead of me there may still be a piece of this puzzle I have not found yet. A piece connected to a question I do not fully understand. A question that, somehow, keeps leading my thoughts back toward you. For a long time, I believed the hardest part of life was not getting what you wanted. I was wrong. The hardest part is not understanding why. A closed door hurts. But a closed door without an explanation can stay with you for years. That was the stage of the investigation I entered next. Not the stage of answers, the stage of frustration. Because once you begin noticing patterns, you cannot easily stop. The questions multiply. The evidence grows. And yet certainty remains out of reach. I remember a period when everything seemed to be moving backward. Opportunities disappeared faster than they arrived. Conversations stalled before they became meaningful. Plans dissolved without warning. I felt as though I was walking through fog, unable to see more than a few steps ahead. What made it difficult was not the loss itself. It was the repetition, the same disappointment appearing through different circumstances, the same feeling of almost reaching something before it slipped away, again and again and again. At the time, I assumed life was simply being cruel. That explanation felt reasonable. After all, randomness can look unfair. But eventually, even that explanation began to crack, because some of the things I lost should have hurt forever, yet they did not. That realization became another clue. Think about your own life for a moment. Have you ever fought desperately to keep something, only to realize years later you were grateful it left? A relationship, a plan, a dream, a version of yourself. At the time it feels devastating. Then time passes, perspective arrives, and suddenly what looked like destruction begins to resemble protection. I did not understand that then. I only understood disappointment. One evening I found myself sitting alone in a quiet cafe. Outside, rain moved steadily across the windows. Inside, conversations blended into a distant hum. I opened an old notebook and began reviewing entries from previous years. Not intentionally searching for patterns, just reading. But before long, I noticed something unsettling. The same lesson appeared repeatedly in different handwriting, different years, different situations. Same lesson: patience, trust, letting go. The words changed, the circumstances changed, the lesson did not. And that is where another question emerged. Why would life keep teaching the same thing unless I had not learned it yet? At the time, I ignored it, but the pattern returned. A few months later, someone asked me a simple question. One of those questions that appears harmless until it follows you home. They asked, what if every major disappointment in your life was preparing you for something you could not recognize yet? I laughed, not because it was impossible, because it sounded too convenient, too comforting, too easy, the kind of explanation people create to survive hardship. Yet the question refused to leave. Days passed, then weeks. Still there. What if? What if being delayed is different from being denied? What if timing matters more than we realize? What if some doors close because we arrived too early rather than because we arrived at the wrong place? I still cannot fully explain it, but those questions changed how I viewed my past. Instead of asking why things ended, I began asking what they taught. Instead of asking why people left, I began asking what they revealed. Instead of asking why the road disappeared, I began asking where it redirected me. And slowly, the evidence began arranging itself differently, not into certainty, into possibility. That distinction matters. Because I am not claiming to know some hidden truth about destiny. I am simply observing what happened. Observing that many events I once labeled failures later proved necessary. Observing that several of my greatest frustrations became turning points. Observing that life often made sense only in reverse. Looking back, the timing feels impossible to ignore. There was one particular opportunity I spent years regretting. Years. I replayed it countless times. What I should have said, what I should have done, how differently things might have unfolded. Then one day I discovered information that completely changed my perspective. If that opportunity had worked out exactly as I wanted, it would have led me directly into circumstances that would have damaged my life. The realization stopped me cold, because for years I had been mourning something that was actually protecting me. And suddenly I wondered how many other disappointments belonged in the same category. How many unanswered prayers had hidden answers inside them. How many missed opportunities were actually missed dangers. How many delays were acts of preservation. Stay with me for a moment, because this is where the pieces start connecting. The investigation was no longer about coincidence. It was becoming an investigation into timing. Why certain things arrived late. Why certain people appeared briefly. Why certain lessons repeated. Why certain roads ended exactly where they did. And during all of this, another strange pattern emerged. The moments that changed me most were rarely dramatic. They were quiet. A conversation. A sentence. A memory resurfacing unexpectedly. A familiar feeling arriving without explanation. A dream that lingered long after morning. A missed call that somehow altered the direction of an entire week. Small things, almost invisible things. The kind of moments most people overlook, yet those moments seemed connected by an invisible thread. A thread I could sense but not see. And that thread led me toward a realization I resisted for years. Perhaps the greatest mistakes of my life were not the doors I walked through. Perhaps they were the lessons I refused to recognize when they first appeared, because life is patient, far more patient than we are. It returns with the same lesson wearing different faces, different cities, different circumstances, different names, until eventually we understand, or at least begin to. And when I finally considered that possibility, another question surfaced. A question both hopeful and unsettling. If life had spent years preparing me through repeated lessons, what exactly was I being prepared for? I did not know then. Truthfully, I still do not know completely. But for the first time, I began to suspect that somewhere ahead, hidden beyond all those delays and detours, there was a connection I had not yet made. A missing piece, a future encounter, something or someone that would explain why so many paths had curved the way they did. And for reasons I could not yet understand, that possibility no longer felt impossible. There comes a point in every investigation when the original explanation stops working, not because it was completely wrong, because it becomes too small. That is what happened to me. For years, I explained everything through circumstance. Success happened because of effort. Failure happened because of mistakes. Coincidences were just coincidences. Delays were unfortunate timing. The formula seemed simple enough. Then life started presenting evidence that did not fit. And once enough evidence accumulates, even the most comfortable explanation begins to collapse. I remember one particular winter evening. The city outside was quiet. Cold rain tapped against the window in uneven rhythms. I was sitting alone with a notebook open in front of me, reviewing entries from different years of my life. The original intention was simple. Organize old thoughts, clear mental clutter, move on. Instead, I discovered something unexpected. The person writing those entries kept changing, but the questions remained the same. Different age, different city, different circumstances. Same questions. Why does this keep happening? Why do certain connections appear and disappear? Why do some opportunities arrive only after I stop pursuing them? Why do the things I need most seem determined to arrive late? Page after page revealed the same pattern. I had changed. The mystery had not. And that realization unsettled me more than I expected. Because if the questions survived every chapter of my life, perhaps they were connected to something deeper than circumstances. Perhaps they were pointing towards something I still could not see. At the time, I ignored it, but the pattern returned. Not through a notebook, through a memory. One afternoon, while waiting in a crowded airport terminal, I found myself watching strangers walk toward departure gates. Some were saying goodbye. Others were being welcomed home. Most appeared completely ordinary. Yet something about the scene held my attention. Maybe it was because airports have always felt symbolic to me. Everyone is between places, between versions of their lives, between what was and what will be. And as I watched those departures unfold, a thought arrived unexpectedly. What if most of life happens in the waiting? Not at the destination, not at the beginning, but in the space between. The thought stayed with me, because waiting had defined far more of my life than achievement ever had. waiting for answers, waiting for clarity, waiting for opportunities, waiting for certain wounds to heal, waiting for things to make sense. And suddenly I realized something uncomfortable. I had spent years treating waiting as an interruption. What if it was actually part of the process? What if some of the most important work happens when nothing appears to be happening? I still cannot fully explain it, but that question changed the investigation, because until then I viewed delays as obstacles. Afterward, I began considering another possibility. Maybe delays serve a purpose. Maybe timing is not merely about when things happen. Maybe timing is also about who we become before they happen. Look closely at this. Imagine receiving everything you wanted 5 years too early. Would you have been ready? Would I? The honest answer, at least for me, is no. There are conversations I could not have handled, lessons I had not learned, blind spots I could not see, people I would have misunderstood, including myself. That realization became another clue. Many of the things I once resented arrived only after I had changed enough to receive them differently. Looking back, the timing feels impossible to ignore. The opportunities remained similar. The person encountering them had changed, and perhaps that made all the difference. What happened next made me reconsider everything. I started examining the people who had entered and exited my life, not judging them, not assigning blame, simply observing, and another pattern emerged. Certain individuals appeared carrying the same lesson. Different personalities, different stories, same lesson. One taught me patience, another taught me honesty, another revealed fears I did not know I carried, another exposed expectations I had placed on others without realizing it. At first, I viewed those people as separate chapters. Now I wonder if they were pages from the same chapter, fragments of the same lesson arriving through different messengers. The idea sounds strange when spoken aloud, yet the evidence kept accumulating. The same emotional challenges, the same crossroads, the same opportunities to grow, again and again. As though life refused to advance until I understood something important. Stay with me for a moment, because this is where the pieces start connecting. The investigation was no longer focused on events. It was focused on preparation. The possibility that every repeated lesson was shaping something. Not controlling the future, preparing for it. And strangely, that possibility brought peace rather than fear. A strange peace during chaos. One of those feelings that arrives quietly, without explanation, without proof, just enough certainty to continue walking. Not certainty about what was ahead, certainty that the path itself mattered, that the lessons mattered, that the waiting mattered, that even the unanswered questions mattered, because perhaps questions are not always obstacles. Perhaps some questions are invitations. Invitations to keep searching. Invitations to keep growing. Invitations to remain open to possibilities we cannot yet understand. By then, the old explanation had completely collapsed. Life no longer looked random enough to dismiss. Not because I had found all the answers, because I had found too many patterns. Patterns hiding inside disappointment. Patterns hiding inside delay. Patterns hiding inside ordinary moments that seemed insignificant at the time. And among all those patterns, one possibility continued returning. Quietly, persistently, almost like a familiar melody heard from another room. The possibility that some of these lessons were not only preparing me for a different future, They were preparing me to recognize someone when the time finally came. I did not know who that person was. I had no evidence, only a growing suspicion. The same kind of suspicion that began this entire investigation. A feeling that certain pieces of the puzzle existed long before I knew where they belonged. And somewhere beyond the horizon of everything I understood, another piece seemed to be waiting. There was a time when I believed growth meant finding new answers. Now I am not so sure. Sometimes growth looks more like recognizing an old lesson when it returns wearing a different face. That realization took me longer than I would like to admit, because for years, I considered repetition a sign of failure. If the same challenge appeared again, I assumed I had done something wrong. If the same disappointment returned, I assumed I had not worked hard enough. If the same emotional wound reopened, I assumed I had never healed. It seemed logical. Then life revealed something I had overlooked. The lesson was repeating, but I was not the same person encountering it. And that changed everything. I remember walking alone one evening through unfamiliar streets after a long day. The city lights reflected off rain-soaked pavement. Cars passed occasionally. Most windows were glowing with ordinary lives unfolding behind them. Conversations, meals, laughter, small moments invisible to everyone except the people living them. As I walked, a familiar feeling appeared. Not an emotion exactly, more like a memory without a picture attached to it. A feeling I had encountered before, years earlier, in a completely different place. The strange part was not the feeling itself. The strange part was my response. The first time it appeared, it frightened me. This time, it didn't. The lesson had returned, but I had changed, and that is where another piece of the puzzle revealed itself. Perhaps repeated lessons are not evidence that we failed. Perhaps they are evidence that life is giving us another opportunity to see how far we have come. At the time, I ignored it, but the pattern returned. A few weeks later, I received an unexpected message. Nothing extraordinary, just a simple conversation that gradually became meaningful. Yet during that exchange, I noticed something surprising. The same fear that once would have controlled my decisions no longer had the same power. It was still there, but weaker, like an echo rather than a voice. That observation stayed with me, because I realized many of the struggles I thought I was endlessly repeating were actually changing, slowly, quietly, almost invisibly. The lesson remained familiar. My relationship with the lesson had evolved, and suddenly, years of confusion began arranging themselves differently. Think about your own life for a moment. Have you ever encountered a situation that once overwhelmed you, only to discover it no longer affects you the same way? The situation may look identical, yet something inside you responds differently. That difference matters more than we realize, because transformation rarely announces itself. It happens gradually, one decision at a time, one disappointment at a time, one lesson at a time. Looking back, the timing feels impossible to ignore. Some of the hardest seasons of my life taught lessons I would not understand until much later. At the time, I wanted immediate answers, immediate clarity, immediate relief. Instead, I received experiences that seemed disconnected, experiences that felt unfair, experiences that often raised more questions than answers. Only years later did they reveal what they had been teaching all along: patience, humility, trust, perspective. The ability to recognize what truly matters. the ability to release what does not. I still cannot fully explain it, but there is something remarkable about lessons that return. They reveal our blind spots, not to shame us, to help us see. And I had many blind spots, more than I realized. One of the biggest involved control. For most of my life, I believed certainty would create peace. If I understood everything, I could relax. If I knew where the road led, I could move forward confidently. If I could predict outcomes, I would stop worrying. Simple, reasonable, completely wrong, because life consistently refused to provide certainty. Yet somehow peace still appeared occasionally. Not when answers arrived, when acceptance arrived. That realization challenged everything. Peace was not hiding inside certainty. Peace was hiding inside trust. Trusting the process. Trusting the lessons. Trusting that not every unanswered question required an immediate answer. Stay with me for a moment, because this is where the pieces start connecting. Many of the lessons that repeated throughout my life shared a common theme. They forced me to release expectations. Expectations about timing, expectations about outcomes, expectations about people, especially people. And perhaps that was necessary, because expectations can prevent us from seeing reality clearly. They can cause us to miss what is actually happening while focusing on what we hoped would happen. I know, because I did it repeatedly. I expected certain paths to matter. Later discovered they did not. I overlooked certain moments. Later discovered they mattered deeply. I chased some opportunities, ignored others, then watched time reverse my assumptions. Again and again. The pattern became impossible to dismiss. The lessons were not only teaching me about life, they were teaching me about perception, about seeing more clearly, about recognizing value in places I once overlooked. And somewhere during that process, another possibility began taking shape, a possibility I resisted because it felt too personal. What if preparation is not only about becoming ready for opportunities? What if it is also about becoming capable of recognizing the right people? People whose significance might otherwise be missed. People who appear ordinary at first. People who arrive without dramatic introductions. People whose importance becomes visible only after enough lessons have been learned. The idea lingered, quietly, patiently, never demanding attention, simply waiting, much like many of the clues that had appeared throughout this investigation. And the more I reflected on it, the more another question emerged. What if some connections only make sense after we become the version of ourselves capable of understanding them? If that is true, then perhaps every repeated lesson had been serving a purpose beyond personal growth. Perhaps they were teaching me how to recognize something I had not encountered yet. Or perhaps someone, a future piece of the puzzle, a piece that even now felt closer than before, not visible, not identified, but no longer impossible to imagine. If I am being completely honest, the most difficult discoveries in this investigation were never about other people. They were about me. Patterns are fascinating when they point outward. They become uncomfortable when they point inward. For years, I focused on the events themselves, the closed doors, the missed opportunities, the unexpected departures, the delays that seemed impossible to understand. I studied them carefully, examined them from every angle, tried to uncover what they meant. What I did not realize was that I was overlooking the most important piece of evidence, my own blind spots. And once I started noticing them, I began seeing them everywhere. not all at once, slowly. The way sunrise gradually reveals details hidden in darkness. One memory comes back often. I was sitting alone late at night in an apartment that overlooked the city. The lights outside stretched endlessly into the distance, thousands of lives unfolding simultaneously, thousands of stories, thousands of questions. And there I was, staring through the glass, convinced that life was withholding answers from me. Then a thought arrived that stopped me. What if the answers had been present the entire time? What if I simply could not see them? The idea irritated me because it shifted responsibility. It meant the mystery might not exist entirely outside of me. Part of it might exist within me. At the time, I ignored it, but the pattern returned, and this time it arrived through a familiar lesson, one I seemed determined to repeat. I would encounter a situation, interpret it immediately, reach a conclusion, then months or years later discover I had misunderstood it completely. The event had not changed, my perspective had. That happened more times than I care to admit. Enough times to force another question. How many things in my life had I misunderstood, simply because I was looking through the wrong lens? The question lingered, and once it appeared, it started connecting pieces I had never connected before. Some of my greatest disappointments came from assumptions. Assumptions about how things should unfold. Assumptions about who people were. Assumptions about what success looked like. Assumptions about what happiness required. The assumptions felt invisible while I carried them. Only later did I realize how much they influenced my decisions. Think about your own life for a moment. Have you ever been absolutely certain about something, only to discover later that you were seeing only part of the picture? I think most of us have. The difficult part is recognizing it while it is happening, because certainty feels convincing, even when it is wrong, especially when it is wrong. Looking back, the timing feels impossible to ignore. Many of the lessons that repeated throughout my life seemed designed to expose a different blind spot. One revealed impatience, another revealed fear, another revealed pride disguised as self-protection. That one surprised me, because I never considered myself proud. Yet there are many forms of pride. Some are loud, others are quiet. Some appear as confidence, others appear as stubborn independence. The belief that we can figure everything out ourselves. The belief that we do not need help. The belief that vulnerability is weakness. For years, I carried versions of those beliefs without recognizing them, and life kept presenting situations that challenged them again and again and again. Not cruelly, patiently, almost as though the lesson refused to leave until I understood it. I still cannot fully explain it. But there is something remarkable about recurring challenges. They often reveal parts of ourselves we would rather avoid. The fears beneath the fears, the wounds beneath the wounds, the questions beneath the questions. And when those deeper layers become visible, everything begins to look different. That happened to me during a period when nothing seemed to make sense. Plans stalled. Progress slowed. Answers disappeared. For a while I felt lost. Then one day I reviewed old journal entries from that same season. What I discovered shocked me. The version of me writing those pages was worried about problems that no longer existed, terrified of outcomes that never happened, certain of conclusions that proved false. Yet at the time, every concern felt real, every fear felt justified, every prediction felt accurate. That realization humbled me, because it exposed how limited my perspective had been. And if I had been wrong then, where else might I be wrong now? Stay with me for a moment, because this is where the pieces start connecting. The investigation had begun with external patterns. Now it was revealing internal ones, patterns of thought, patterns of fear, patterns of expectation, patterns that shaped how I interpreted everything around me. And perhaps those patterns mattered just as much as the events themselves, maybe more. Because two people can experience the same event and draw completely different conclusions. The difference is not the event. The difference is the lens. That realization changed the way I approached every unanswered question. Instead of asking only what happened, I began asking why I interpreted it the way I did. Instead of asking why certain doors closed, I began asking why I was so attached to them. Instead of asking why certain people left, I began asking what I had expected from them. The answers were not always comfortable, but they were honest. And honesty became one of the most valuable tools in the entire investigation. Because without honesty, patterns remain hidden. With honesty, even painful lessons become useful. And among all the blind spots I uncovered, one stood out more than the rest. I had spent years searching for meaning somewhere far away, in future events, future answers, future destinations. Yet many of the clues had been surrounding me all along, waiting patiently, like puzzle pieces sitting on the table while I searched the entire room. That realization brought an unexpected sense of peace. Not because the mystery was solved, because I no longer felt compelled to force answers before their time. For the first time, I could simply observe, listen, pay attention, and remain open to possibilities, including one possibility that continued returning no matter how often I dismissed it. The possibility that somewhere beyond all these lessons, delays, and discoveries, there existed a connection I was gradually becoming capable of recognizing, not because destiny guaranteed it, not because the future was written, but because every lesson seemed to be teaching me how to see more clearly. And perhaps clear vision is exactly what will be needed when the next piece of the puzzle finally appears. There is a difference between believing something and becoming willing to consider it. For most of my life, I demanded certainty before I would accept any possibility. Evidence first, conclusions later. That seemed reasonable, responsible, even. But this investigation slowly taught me something unexpected. Some of life's most important questions cannot be approached that way. Not because evidence is unimportant, because the evidence often arrives in fragments. A piece here, a pattern there, a realization years later. A connection visible only when enough distance exists to see the larger picture. And eventually, you reach a point where the question is no longer whether the pieces exist. The question becomes what they might mean when placed together. That is where I found myself, standing in front of a puzzle I had been assembling for years without realizing it. Not complete, not solved, but undeniably taking shape. I remember one evening when the realization arrived more clearly than ever before. The city had already gone quiet. The lights from distant buildings shimmered beyond the window. My phone sat untouched beside me. No messages, no distractions, just silence, the kind of silence that sometimes reveals things noise keeps hidden. I found myself thinking about all the roads that had disappeared beneath my feet, the opportunities that never happened, The people who arrived briefly and vanished again. The strange timing that seemed to govern so many important moments. For years, I viewed those memories separately. That night, for the first time, I viewed them together. And the picture felt different. Not perfect, not complete, but different. The closed doors no longer looked random. The delays no longer looked meaningless. The detours no longer looked accidental. They looked connected, not by certainty, by consistency. At the time, I ignored it, but the pattern returned. The more honestly I reviewed my life, the more difficult coincidence became as a complete explanation. Not because coincidence never exists. Of course, it does. Life contains randomness. Unexpected events happen every day. I know that. What I struggled to explain was repetition. The same lessons, the same themes, the same strange timing, the same moments of unexpected clarity arriving exactly when they were needed, again and again. Different forms, same message. And that is where another question emerged. What if coincidence and meaning are not always opposites? What if some events remain ordinary while still participating in a larger pattern? I still cannot fully explain it, but I no longer feel the need to explain everything immediately. That may be one of the most important lessons this journey has given me. The ability to remain open, to observe before concluding, to notice before dismissing, to wonder before rejecting. Think about your own life for a moment. Have there been moments that stayed with you longer than they should have? Moments that seemed ordinary yet refused to disappear? A conversation, a familiar feeling, a dream that lingered, a person you never fully forgot, a road you almost took, a decision that altered everything. Most people carry memories like that. The difference is whether we pay attention to them. Looking back, the timing feels impossible to ignore. There were moments when life seemed determined to remove everything I thought I wanted. At the time, I called those seasons losses. Now I am less certain, because many of those losses created space. Space for growth, space for understanding, space for possibilities that could not have entered otherwise. And among those possibilities, one continued returning, quietly, patiently, like a question waiting for its moment, the possibility that preparation was never the destination. Preparation was preparation. That sounds obvious now. Yet for years I treated growth itself as the goal. Perhaps growth was only making room for something else. Or someone else. Stay with me for a moment, because this is where the pieces start connecting. I am not saying destiny exists in the way people often describe it. I am not claiming every event was planned. I am not claiming every heartbreak carried hidden instructions. I do not know enough to say those things. What I am saying is simpler. There appears to be a pattern visible only in hindsight, a pattern connecting lessons, timing, losses, and unexpected encounters, a pattern that has followed me for longer than I can explain. And somewhere inside that pattern, another possibility continues to exist. The possibility that some connections are not recognized when they first appear. The possibility that two lives can move through entirely different journeys while unknowingly learning complementary lessons. The possibility that preparation happens on both sides of an unseen future. Years ago, I would have dismissed that idea immediately. Now I cannot. Not because I have proof, because I have questions. And the questions have earned the right to be considered. Perhaps that is what faith actually begins as. Not certainty, not conclusions. A willingness to remain open to possibilities larger than our current understanding. A willingness to admit that life may contain more meaning than we initially assumed. A willingness to acknowledge that some puzzles reveal their image slowly, piece by piece, year by year, lesson by lesson. And if that is true, then maybe the most important piece is not the one already in my hands. Maybe it is the one I have not found yet. The one whose shape has influenced the entire puzzle without ever appearing. The one whose absence explains why certain spaces still feel unfinished. And for reasons I cannot fully explain, when I imagine that missing piece now, I no longer think of it as an event. I think of it as a person. Not someone I know, not someone I can name. Only someone whose existence would make many years of strange time suddenly feel different. Not explained, but understood. And for the first time in this entire investigation, I find myself willing to accept that possibility. When I began this investigation, I thought I was searching for answers. Now I think I was learning how to ask better questions. That may sound like a small difference. It is not, because answers often create conclusions. Questions create awareness, and awareness is what changed everything. For years, I looked at my life as a collection of separate events, individual victories, individual disappointments, individual people, individual mistakes. Nothing connected, nothing intentional, just a series of unrelated chapters moving forward through time. Then the patterns appeared, or perhaps they had always been there. Perhaps I finally slowed down enough to see them. The repeated lessons, the strange timing, the closed doors that later protected me. The opportunities that arrived only after I stopped chasing them. The familiar feelings that returned through different circumstances. The dreams that lingered. The roads that seemed empty until years later. The letters never sent. The conversations that almost happened. The moments that looked ordinary until hindsight illuminated them. Piece after piece. Clue after clue. Question after question. And somewhere along the way, coincidence stopped feeling like a complete explanation. Not because every mystery was solved, because too many fragments pointed in the same direction. I remember sitting alone one morning as sunlight filtered through partially opened curtains. The room was quiet. The world had not fully awakened yet. There was no dramatic realization, no sudden revelation, only a simple thought, a thought that arrived gently enough that I almost missed it. What if meaning does not require certainty? I sat with that question for a long time, because certainty had always been my standard. If I could not prove something, I hesitated to trust it. If I could not explain it completely, I resisted believing it. Yet life itself had never operated according to those rules. Some of the most important things I have ever experienced arrived long before I understood them. Friendships, lessons, opportunities, losses, growth, even healing. None of them announced their significance when they arrived. Their meaning emerged later, and that realization changed the investigation more than any other discovery. At the time, I ignored it. But the pattern returned, again and again. Meaning often arrived before understanding, not after. Looking back, the timing feels impossible to ignore. There were seasons when loneliness felt endless, seasons when unanswered questions seemed louder than hope, Seasons when I wondered whether life was simply a collection of random events disguised as purpose. Yet even during those seasons, certain clues remained. A strange peace during chaos. Unexpected encouragement arriving at the right moment. A lesson resurfacing exactly when I needed it. A reminder hidden inside an ordinary day. Enough to keep me moving forward. Enough to keep me paying attention. Enough to prevent me from completely abandoning the search. And perhaps that was all I needed. Not certainty, just enough light to take the next step. Think about your own life for a moment. Not the obvious moments, the quieter ones, the opportunities that arrived unexpectedly, the doors that closed before you understood why, the people who changed you without realizing it, the disappointments that later revealed hidden gifts, the roads that delayed you, the roads that redirected you, the dreams you forgot, the dreams that refused to forget you. Do not dismiss them too quickly, because sometimes the most important evidence is hidden inside the moments we overlook. I still cannot fully explain everything. I still have questions. Perhaps I always will. Why certain events repeated? Why certain lessons took years to understand? Why some roads ended while others remained open? Why timing seemed so precise in certain moments and completely confusing in others? The investigation remains unfinished. And maybe it always will be, but unfinished does not mean meaningless. That distinction matters. Because for a long time I believed understanding had to come first. Now I suspect meaning often comes first. Understanding follows later. Sometimes much later. Stay with me for a moment, because this is where the final pieces connect. If everything I have observed is tar,